The rope burned through his palms before he even understood he was falling, and Thomas Hargrove hit the cracked earth of his own home pasture with the wind knocked clean out of him, the sun hammering down on land that hadn't seen rain in 14 months. Above him, his last good horse stood trembling, ribs showing through its hide, and somewhere behind him, he could hear his foreman already talking about selling off what cattle hadn't died yet. He lay there in the dust of a ranch that had been his father's and his father's father's, and he did not know, not yet, that the woman walking toward him across that dead grass with a shovel over her shoulder was about to save every last thing he loved. If you have ever watched something you built with your own 2 hands start to slip through your fingers like dry sand, stay with this one to the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this is a story about the kind of love this country tried to warn a man. The drought had come the way droughts always come, slow enough that a man could tell himself it wasn't happening, and then all at once, the way a rope frays for months before it finally gives. Thomas Hargrove had inherited 11,000 acres of good grass country in the Arizona Territory land his grandfather had carved out of nothing, and for 2 years he had watched that grass turn to straw, and the straw turn to dust, and the dust blow away entirely, leaving nothing behind but cracked pale earth that cattle wouldn't even walk across anymore because there was nothing there worth the walking. He had tried everything a rancher knew to try. He had dug 2 new wells that came up dry. He had trailed his herds 40 miles to leased grass that cost him money he didn't have. He had prayed, on the nights when praying still felt like something other than talking to an empty room, for rain that did not come. He was 34 years old, and he was watching the only inheritance he had ever been given die of thirst in front of him, and there was nothing in his hands that could stop it. He had buried his wife 2 years before the drought started, a fever that took her in 4 days, and left him with the ranch, and a silence that seemed to grow bigger every season, filling up rooms she used to fill with noise. He did not talk about her. He did not talk about much of anything, if he could help it. He had learned that a man could run a ranch and raise no children and speak to no one beyond what business required, and that this was its own kind of surviving, even if it was not much of a living. His foreman, a weathered man named Cobb, who had ridden for the Hargrove outfit since before Thomas was born, had taken to watching him with a worry he tried and failed to hide, the way you watch a fence post that's leaning further than it ought to. It was Cobb who first mentioned the woman. She had come into the territory the way certain people came into certain places in those years, quietly and without explanation that anyone bothered to ask for. She lived a half-day's ride from the Hargrove spread, in a small adobe house near the dry wash, with a garden that should not have been able to grow anything at all in that soil, and somehow grew squash and beans and corn in neat green rows that made no sense against the brown world around them. Her name was Ilutsi, and she had grown up among the Chiricahua Apache before the army pushed her people onto reservation land far from these hills, and she had come back to this stretch of country because her mother's mother was buried somewhere in it, though she never said exactly where. And Thomas got the sense she would not have told him, even if he'd asked. He met her the day his best horse went lame trying to reach water that wasn't there, 3 miles past where the old spring used to run, and he was leading the animal home on foot under a sun that felt like a personal insult when he saw her kneeling at the edge of the dry wash, her hands moving through the cracked mud with a patience that struck him as strange given that there was nothing there to be patient about. She did not look up right away. When she did, she looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they are already 3/4 of the way to solving. "Your horse needs water in the next hour or he won't make it," she said, not as a greeting, simply as a fact laid down between them like something set on a counter. "There's a spring a mile north of here. It's not dead. It's just tired of being asked wrong." He did not understand what that meant, not that day. He only knew that she led him a mile north, to a place where the earth folded down into a shallow bowl he had ridden past 100 times without seeing anything in it, and she showed him where to dig, not deep, just 18 inches down through a crust of hardpan that had sealed the water beneath it like a lid on a jar, and there, impossibly, was moisture. then a trickle, then enough for his horse to drink its fill. He did not know how to thank her properly. He tried anyway, and she waved it off, like it cost her nothing, though he would learn later that nothing about her knowledge had ever come cheap. He went back 3 days later, telling himself it was to properly repay her, and stayed for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular, and went back again the week after that, and by the 3rd month of that summer the town of Cutter's Bend had noticed, and the town of Cutter's Bend had opinions. Mrs. Adelaide Prescott, whose late husband had once tried and failed to buy the Hargrove spread out from under Thomas's father, ran the only mercantile in 3 counties, and considered this a license to run the moral affairs of the town as well. She cornered Thomas outside the church one Sunday, her voice pitched low and sweet in the way of a woman who has practiced sounding kind while saying something cruel. "We only worry for you, Thomas," she said. "A woman like that. You don't know what she is underneath the manners. Blood tells, in the end." And your poor wife not 2 years in the ground. He did not answer her. He had learned in the silence since his wife's death that some things were better left unanswered, that arguing with a woman like Adelaide Prescott only fed her, the way arguing with a fire only feeds it air. But he carried her words home with him anyway, the way a man carries a stone in his boot, feeling it with every step even after he tells himself he stopped noticing. Ilutsi noticed anyway. She always noticed. "You went quiet," she said. The next time he rode out to see her, the 2 of them sitting on the low wall outside her adobe house, while the sun went down orange behind the hills. "You've gone quiet before. But this is a different kind of quiet." "It's nothing," he said. "It's never nothing," she said. "It's just something you've decided not to say out loud yet." He looked at her a long moment, at the steadiness in her face, the way she waited without pushing, and something in him gave the way that hard-pan crust had given under her shovel a mile north of the dry wash. "They talk," he said finally. "About you. About us. I know what they say," Ilutsi answered, and there was no bitterness in it, only a tiredness that went down deep, deeper than the 2 years he'd known her, deeper probably than he could see the bottom of. "I have heard it my whole life, Thomas. I heard it as a child when they moved us. I heard it when I came back to bury what family I had left to bury. I will hear it after you and I are both gone into the ground ourselves. It does not change what is true and what is not true. It only tells you what kind of people are doing the talking. I'm not asking you to carry that," he said. "You're not," she agreed, "but you're asking yourself whether you can carry it. That's a different question, and it's yours to answer, not mine." He did not answer it that night. It would take the drought itself and everything that came after to force the answer out of him. The dry season deepened through that autumn into something that old-timers in the territory said they had not seen the like of in 30 years. The Hargrove wells, all 4 of them, gave up entirely. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of his land, the creek his grandfather had built the whole ranch around, the creek that had never once in 50 years failed to run at least a trickle, went bone dry and stayed that way, its bed cracking into plates like the shell of some enormous dead animal. Cobb came to him one evening with numbers on a piece of paper, the kind of numbers that did not leave room for hope, and told him plainly that if they didn't find water within the month, they would lose the herd entirely, every head of it, and likely the ranch along with it inside the year. There was, too, a second trouble stacked atop the first. One Thomas had been keeping to himself the way he kept most things to himself. He had borrowed against the ranch 2 years earlier, in the season after his wife's death, to cover a bad winter, and the note was held by a banker in the county seat named Harlan Voss, a careful, colorless man who had a habit of speaking softly about ruin, the way other men spoke softly about weather. Voss had ridden out himself that same week the creek went dry, sat in Thomas's own kitchen with his hat in his lap, and explained, without any particular malice but without any particular mercy either, that the bank could not extend the note again if the herd failed to make its numbers by spring. He had heard, he said delicately, that Thomas had taken up with an Indian woman from the Wash country, and he wanted Thomas to understand as a friendly matter that certain men on the bank's board found that arrangement troubling, and the troubled men did not always extend patience to a note that was already stretched thin. It was not a threat, Voss said. It was simply a fact laid out plainly, the way facts sometimes needed laying out. Thomas rode out to Eluti's place that same night, arriving well past dark. His horse lathered from the hard ride, and he told her everything. The numbers, the dead creek, the 4 dry wells, the banker's soft voice in his own kitchen, the ranch his grandfather had built and his father had held, and that he was about to lose in front of everyone who had ever doubted whether a Hargrove could hold on to what he'd been given. She listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she listened to everything, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark hills. "There is water on your land," she said finally. "There has always been water on your land. Your grandfather built his house and his wells in the wrong places, because he was thinking like a man who wanted water to come to him instead of learning where the land already wanted to give it. I can show you where it is. But I need you to understand something first, Thomas Hargrove, before I put my hands to your problem." "What?" he said. "This will not be a secret. You can keep quiet and thank me for in private," she said. "If I walk your land and show your foreman where to dig, every man on your crew will see me do it. Every hand who talks in town on Saturday will talk about how the ranch was saved. You will not be able to keep this a private kindness between the two of us anymore. It will become a public fact. Your banker will hear it before the week is out, and he will draw his own conclusions from it, same as the rest of them. Are you prepared for that?" He understood, in that moment, exactly what she was asking him. She was not asking whether he trusted her knowledge. She had proven that already, 100 small times at the spring, a mile north of the Wash, and a dozen places since. She was asking whether he was prepared to let the whole territory see, plainly, and without room for pretending otherwise, exactly who it was that had saved him, and exactly what he thought of her because of it. Whatever cost that clarity carried with a careful man like Voss. "Yes," he said, and he did not hesitate saying it, though later he would tell her that the not hesitating had taken him 2 years to build up to. "Show me." She nodded once, the way she nodded when a decision had been made and there was no more use discussing it, and told him to bring her out to the ranch at first light. She spent 3 days walking his land before she ever put a shovel to it. Cobb watched her with open suspicion those first 2 days, an old cowman's distrust of anything that didn't look like standard practice, and Thomas watched Cobb watch her, and said nothing, waiting. She walked the low places first, the folds and creases in the land where water would gather if it ever fell, tracing the ghost lines of where old washes had run centuries before anyone had thought to call this land a ranch at all. She looked at the way certain plants grew, the mesquite and the cottonwood, species that would not put down roots at all unless there was moisture within reach beneath them, no matter how dead the surface looked. She examined the color of the soil in patches that seemed, to Thomas's eye, entirely identical to the soil around them, and found differences there that told her something about what lay beneath. She crouched at one point and simply held a handful of dry earth to her face and breathed it in, the way another person might smell bread to judge whether it had finished rising, and said nothing about what she found there, only moved on, marking the spot in her memory the way she seemed to mark everything. "Here," she said finally on the 3rd day, standing in a shallow basin close to the eastern boundary not far from the dead creek bed, and here she walked 40 yards further and marked a second spot. "Your grandfather dug his wells on the high ground because he thought high ground was safer ground, less likely to flood, easier to build near. But this country does not keep its water in the high ground. It keeps it in the old channels, the ones the surface forgot, but the ground remembers. Dig here and dig there, no more than 20 feet down, and you will find water enough to run your herd through this drought and the next one besides." Cobb, standing at Thomas's shoulder, made a small sound of disbelief, quickly swallowed, 20 feet, he said. We dug 60 at the north well and hit nothing. You dug in the wrong place, Iluzzi said, without any heat in it, simply stating what she saw as true. 60 feet in the wrong place will always find less than 20 feet in the right one. Thomas looked at his foreman. Dig it, he said. They found water at 18 feet in the first spot and at 22 in the second, water so clean and so plentiful that Cobb, a man who had not shown much emotion in the 30 years Thomas had known him, took off his hat and stood there a long moment just looking at it come up out of the ground before he said, quiet enough that only Thomas heard it. Well, I'll be damned. The younger hands on the crew, a scattering of boys not much past 20 who had signed on with the Hargrove outfit only that spring, reacted each in their own particular way, the way a row of men will always break apart into individual response when something larger than any one of them happens in front of their eyes. One of them, a lanky boy named Silas, laughed out loud and slapped his hat against his thigh like he'd witnessed a magic trick. Another, older and more careful with his opinions, only nodded slowly, filing the thing away to think on later. A third said nothing at all, only looked at Iluzzi with an expression that Thomas recognized, because he had worn it himself once. The particular look of a man realizing that something he had assumed was simple was in fact deep enough to drown in, if you weren't careful how you approached it. Ward moved through Cutter's Bend the way water moves through dry ground, quick and thorough, and impossible to stop once it had started. By the following Sunday, everyone in 3 counties knew that Thomas Hargrove's ranch had been saved from ruin by the Apache woman who lived near the dry wash, and everyone in 3 counties had an opinion about what that meant. Some of those opinions were kind, or kind enough. Old man Pruitt, who ran the feed store and had known Thomas's grandfather personally, said plainly to anyone who'd listen that a man would be a fool to care what color a savior came in so long as the saving got done. The town doctor, a quiet man named Whitfield, who had tended half the county through fevers and broken bones and had seen enough death to have run out of patience for small cruelties, said something similar, though with less patience for the people who needed convincing. But Harlan Voss's opinion, when it came, arrived in the shape of a letter rather than a kitchen conversation, brief and correct in its language, informing Thomas that the bank had reconsidered the timeline on his note and would require partial payment within 60 days, rather than the season previously agreed. A reassessment of risk. Thomas read the letter twice at his kitchen table, alone, the same table where Voss had once sat with his hat in his lap, speaking softly of ruin, and he understood exactly what risk had been reassessed and exactly why, though the letter was too careful ever to say so plainly. He did not tell Iluzzi right away. He told himself it was because there was nothing to be done about it yet, but the truth, when he finally admitted it to himself on a long ride home in the dark, was that he was ashamed, not of her, never of her, but of the world that kept finding new doors to close in front of the two of them. And ashamed that he did not yet know how he would keep this particular door from shutting. It was Cobb in the end who forced the matter into the open, catching Thomas alone in the barn one evening, staring at figures on a page without writing anything down. "You're carrying something," Cobb said in the plain, unhurried way he said most things. "Been carrying it since that letter came from town. A man in this outfit 30 years learns to read another man's shoulders. Yours have been bent since Tuesday." Thomas told him then about Voss, about the 60 days, about the reassessed risk that was not really about risk at all. Cobb was quiet a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "You know what I think," he said finally. "For whatever a foreman's thinking is worth to a man who owns the deed, I think you take that letter to Iluzzi before you take it anywhere else, including your own worrying. She found water where 3 generations of Hargroves found dust. I expect she's got a thought or two about a banker as well." Thomas wrote out that same night. Iluzzi read the letter by lamplight at her own kitchen table, twice through, her face giving away nothing while she did it, and when she set it down she did not look angry, only thoughtful, in the way she looked when she was walking a piece of land and deciding where the water wanted to be found. "Your banker has made a mistake," she said finally, "though he does not know it yet. He thinks the ranch's only value to him is the herd and the grass. He has not asked himself what a ranch is worth when it is the only outfit in 3 counties that never runs dry. Ranchers all through this territory are losing cattle to this drought, Thomas. Every outfit but yours. That is worth more to a careful man than his own prejudices, if someone puts the arithmetic in front of him plainly enough. You want me to go negotiate with the man threatening to take my grandfather's ranch," Thomas said. "I want you to go show him a full well instead of an empty argument," Iluzzi said. "Bring him out here. Let him see the water himself, and let him do the arithmetic on his own, in front of it, rather than in a letter written at a comfortable distance from the truth. Men like Voss are careful before they are cruel. Give his carefulness something better to calculate than his fear." Thomas rode into the county seat 3 days later and asked Harlan Voss, plainly and without apology, to ride out and see the ranch for himself before making any final decision on the note. Voss came reluctant and correct as ever, and stood at the edge of the new well with his hands folded behind his back, while Cobb hauled up a full bucket to show him, and while Iluzzi, standing a few respectful paces off, said nothing at all, letting the water speak for itself, the way she had always preferred to let facts speak rather than argument. Voss looked at the water a long time. He looked, too, at the green edge of pasture near the well, already recovering where the rest of the range still lay brown and cracked, and something in his careful banker's face shifted the way a column of figures shifts when a man finds a number he had not accounted for. "I'll want a report on well capacity before I bring this to the board," he said finally, which was not an apology, and was not warmth but was, Thomas understood, the closest thing to a retreat a man like Voss was. The 60-day letter was quietly withdrawn within the month, replaced by a new note on the original terms, and Voss never spoke of the matter again in any way that touched on Iluzzi's blood rather than her results, though Thomas suspected the man's private opinions had not traveled nearly so far as his public arithmetic. It reached its worst point, that whole difficult season at the Fall Social, an event held every year in the Cutter's Bend meeting hall that the whole town turned out for. Ranchers and their wives and the shopkeepers and the schoolteacher all crowded together under lantern light with cider and pie and a fiddle player who'd ridden in from 2 towns over. Thomas brought Iluzzi with him that year, the first time he had ever brought her to a town gathering, and the room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone in them is pretending very hard not to be looking at something. Adelaide Prescott found her chance an hour into the evening, cornering the 2 of them near the punch table with a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. "It's a fine thing you've done for the Hargrove Ranch," she said to Iluzzi, in a voice pitched to carry to the tables nearest them. "Digging in the dirt like that. I suppose your people have a natural talent for that kind of work. Grubbing in the ground. It must come easy to you, being closer to the earth than the rest of us." The room did not go silent so much as it seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what shape this humiliation would take, whether Iluzzi would flinch, whether Thomas would find some way to smooth it over the way men in his position usually did, with an apologetic laugh, and a change of subject that let everyone move on without anyone having to be responsible for what had just been said out loud. Iluzzi did not flinch. "My grandmother taught me to read water in the ground before I could read words on a page," she said evenly, without a trace of anger in it, though every word landed with the weight of a stone set down deliberately. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from a people who lived on this land and knew how to survive its droughts for longer than this town has had a name. It is not luck, Mrs. Prescott, and it is not because I am closer to the dirt than you are. It is because my people paid attention to something your people were too busy conquering to learn. A few people near enough to hear it went very still. Old man Pruitt, standing 3 tables away, made a sound that might have been a laugh he was trying hard to swallow. Adelaide Prescott's mouth thinned. "Well," she said, "I only meant, I know what you meant. Iluzi said, still without raising her voice, still perfectly calm, and it was the calm, more than anything, that seemed to unsettle the older woman more than any anger could have. You've meant it for as long as I've known you, and you'll go on meaning it whether I answer you kindly or not. So I've decided to stop being kind about it. Thomas, standing beside her, felt something in his chest that he had not felt in 2 years, something that took him a moment to recognize his pride, sharp and clean and entirely without shame in it. He set his hand at the small of Iluzi's back, not to guide her away, but simply to stand beside her, visibly, in front of the whole room. My ranch would be dust and dead cattle right now, if not for her, he said, loud enough that it reached every table in that hall. Every animal I've got left alive, I owe to what she knows and what she was generous enough to share with me. My note at the bank would be called in and this ranch sold out from under me, if not for her arithmetic being better than my fear. Anyone in this room who has a problem standing near her had best have a problem standing near me too, because I don't intend to be found in different company than she's in tonight or any night after. It was the most he had said in public since his wife's funeral. The room did not erupt into applause, because rooms like that one rarely did, not in that time and place, but something shifted in it anyway. A current running under the surface the way water had always run under Thomas's own dead-looking land, waiting for someone to know where to dig. Adelaide Prescott left the social early that night, and though she did not stop talking entirely, women like her rarely stopped entirely. Thomas had learned they only quieted for a season and waited for a new opening. The shape of what the town believed about Iluzi had shifted, cracked open the way that hardpan crust had cracked open over the spring, letting something through that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The winter that followed brought its own trial, quieter than the bank's letter but sharper in its way, when Cobb fell badly ill with a fever that Dr. Whitfield could not name and could not break. 3 days of it that left the old foreman gray and shaking in his bunk while the whole outfit moved through its chores in a hush. The particular hush of men who did not know how to say out loud that they were afraid. Iluzi sat with him 2 nights running, steeping barks and roots that Whitfield eyed with open professional skepticism, until on the 3rd morning, Cobb's fever broke, and he asked, in a rasping whisper, for coffee and his boots. In that order, which the whole bunkhouse took as sufficient proof of the old man's recovery. Whitfield, to his credit, asked Iluzi afterward, plainly and without the condescension he might have used a year before, what she had given the old man and where she had learned it, and listened to her answer the way a careful physician listens to a colleague rather than a curiosity, and something in that exchange, small as it was, did more to settle the town's remaining doubts than any speech could have. The wells held through that winter, and through the dry spring that followed, water running clean and steady out of ground that Thomas's own grandfather had walked past for 50 years without ever guessing what lay beneath it. Cobb, fully recovered and stubbornly back at work before Whitfield thought-wise, told any new hand who arrived at the Hargrove outfit the story of the woman who'd found water where 3 generations of Hargrove men had found nothing but dust, and told it notably, with respect rather than the careful, hedging tone people sometimes used when they wanted credit to sound smaller than it was. Thomas asked Iluzi to marry him in the spring at the edge of the dry wash, where he had first watched her kneel in cracked mud with a patience he had not understood, in the exact place where she'd first shown him where his own land had been trying to give him water all along. He did not make a long speech of it. He had never been a man for long speeches, and 2 years of knowing her had taught him that she did not need one, that she preferred a plain truth laid down between them like something set on a counter, more than she would ever prefer pretty words wrapped around an uncertain feeling. "I don't have anything to offer you that your own hands haven't already earned twice over," he said. "The land's yours as much as mine, if you'll have it, and me along with it, if you'll have that too." She looked at him a long moment, the way she had looked at him that first day at the dry wash, like a woman assessing a problem she was already most of the way to solving, except that this time there was nothing left to solve, Only a decision left to make, and she had already made it somewhere in the 2 years of small kindnesses and long silences and one public humiliation answered without flinching. "I'll have both," she said. They were married that summer in a small ceremony at the ranch house, not the church in town, though the church would have had them by then. Town opinion having turned the slow, grudging way town opinion turns when the facts on the ground refuse to cooperate with the old prejudices. Cobb stood as Thomas's witness. Old Man Pruitt came, and Dr. Whitfield, and a dozen ranch hands who had come to think of Aluzi as something closer to a partner in the outfit's survival than a curiosity to be whispered about. Adelaide Prescott did not attend, though she sent, strangely, a small gift of preserves by way of her housekeeper, a gesture that fooled no one into thinking her heart had changed, only that she had calculated the cost of open opposition had grown too high to keep paying. Her housekeeper, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth who had worked in the Prescott house for a dozen years and had heard every unkind word Adelaide had ever said about the Hargrove match, lingered a moment at the ceremony's edge after delivering the preserves and said quietly to Aluzi before hurrying back to her employer's business that she had always thought the town's talk was cruel and small, and that she hoped they knew there were more people wishing them well than ever said so out loud. It was a small thing, said quickly and shyly, but Aluzi thanked her for it the way she thanked people for things that mattered plainly and without excess. They built a life on that ranch together that neither of them had quite dared imagine 2 years before, in the days when Thomas had been a silent widower, going through the motions of a life he no longer believed in, and Aluzi had been a woman who had learned, through hard experience, to expect distance rather than welcome from the world around her. She taught him, over the years that followed, more than the location of 2 hidden springs. She taught him to read the color changes in the soil that told him when a graze had been pushed too hard and needed rest before it turned to true desert. She taught him which plants signaled water at what depths and which signaled poison in the ground that no well should be dug near. She taught the ranch hands, in time, some of what she knew, not all of it, because some knowledge she kept for herself and for the memory of the grandmother who'd given it to her, but enough that the Hargrove outfit became known, in time, as the outfit that never lost cattle to drought the way its neighbors sometimes did. To listen to land that had been trying to speak all along. Their first child, a daughter, was born the following spring, and they named her for Aluzi's grandmother, a name that the ranch hands learned to say correctly, because Aluzi corrected them, gently but without exception, every time they got it wrong, until getting it right simply became the way it was done at the Hargrove Ranch. The way saying please and thank you was simply the way it was done, an ordinary courtesy rather than an extraordinary accommodation. The old shovel Aluzi had carried that first day at the dry wash never left the ranch. It hung, in time, on a peg just inside the kitchen door, worn smooth at the handle from years of use, and it became, without either of them ever deciding it should, a kind of marker for the whole family's history, the thing children touched on their way out the door for luck, the way other families touched a lucky coin or a carved token. The thing Thomas would look at, some evenings, when he wanted to remember exactly how close he had come to losing everything, and exactly what had been standing in the dust beside him when he hadn't. The drought broke, eventually, the way all droughts eventually break, in a wet winter that filled the dead creek bed back to its banks and turned the pastures green again for the first time in 3 years. But the wells Aluzi had found never went dry again, even in the leaner seasons that followed, because they had been dug where the water had always wanted to be found, rather than where a man's assumptions had told him to look for it. Years later, when Thomas and Aluzi's daughter had children of her own, and those children asked, as children always do, how their grandparents had come to be together, it was Cobb, grown old and slow but sharp as ever in the telling of a story, who told it best, sitting on the porch of the Hargrove ranch house in the long light of an evening in autumn. "Everybody in this territory told your grandfather not to marry her," he would say. And there was no bitterness in the telling, only the satisfaction of a man who had watched a thing prove itself true over the long span of years rather than the short span of a season's gossip. Told him she was trouble. Told him blood told. In the end, whatever fool thing that was supposed to mean. Told him a careful banker in the county seat would take the whole outfit out from under him besides. And your grandfather, God rest him, never was much of a talker, never was much for arguing a point out loud, but he showed them anyway. Every green pasture on this ranch, every head of cattle that made it through that drought, every well that never went dry again after she put her hands to it, that was his answer to every last one of them, and he never had to raise his voice to give it. Hey, the old-timers in Cutter's Bend, the ones who remembered that season and the years that followed it, would tell you, if you asked them on the right kind of evening, that the real lesson of the Hargrove Ranch was never really about water at all, though the water had certainly saved it. It was about the particular foolishness of a town that near ruined itself, trying to decide who was permitted to belong to it, and the particular grace of two people who decided together not to wait for that permission before they built a life worth having. It was about a man who had gone quiet with grief until a woman taught him, patiently, and without asking anything in return at first, that some silences are worth breaking, and some ground, however dead it looks on the surface, is only waiting for someone patient enough and humble enough to learn where to dig. Home, in the end, was never the land itself, however many acres of it a man's grandfather had claimed and fenced and called his own. Home was the place where the water finally ran clean and stayed running, because two people had been brave enough to dig there together, in full view of everyone who told them they shouldn't.